7th day, Upper Water Month, 343 High Imperial Calendar. Hello, diary. Elena Gran here. I don't know why I'm addressing my diary, but we'll be together from now on. Please treat me well. We arrived at Lagers this morning. I thought Wyvernford was big, but there are so many different people here. There were plenty of elves in Wyvernford, and you could always see nereids and merfolk in the river, but Lagers has everything. I counted at least 9 different types of beastmen. There are Orthrus and their cousins, too. Terrapus live up on all the towers and Fomayans are crawling all over the place. Kinda weird when you have people flying around and walking on the walls. The capital really feels like a capital, you know? Everything's so grand, like it's out to make a statement. Some of the buildings are so huge that they block out the sky. Everywhere is busy, busy, busy. I'm pretty sure I was walking around with my mouth open all day like a country yokel. Who am I kidding? I am a country yokel. There's just no hiding it here. There are fountains and gardens everywhere and waterways along every main street. Everyone can get everywhere easy. Except for me. I got lost 2 blocks out of the harbor. A nice guy helped me out. Really nice. Maybe spring has come early for Elena Gran? Anyway, it's been a long day. I managed to figure out how to get to the Imperial Archive from my place, so hopefully, I won't be late for my first day of work. Elena. Sitting behind a desk piled high with dictionaries, anthologies and other texts that she thought might be useful for translation, Clara Corlin tapped her lip thoughtfully with the base of her pen. It had been a week since Ludmilla dropped off a copy of the diary she had found in the Katsa Plains. After over 30 hours poring through piles of references, Clara decided that she had come up with a satisfactory translation for the first entry. A basic translation, at any rate. There were still words that she wasn't certain about, but, hopefully, her grasp of the script would expand as she worked on further entries. That being said, a somewhat comprehensive analysis of the language employed would most likely take decades. Ludmilla had gone over a few pages with her, noting that significant portions of the script employed were like that which was used by various languages in the region, but her friend's comparison was backwards. It was the regional scripts of the present day that had elements from the script in the diary. To be precise, the language employed appeared to be the root of many different languages. She would not be surprised if the elements foreign to human languages could be found in those of non-human societies. One might be led to believe that such a language would be more primitive than the languages used in the present, but it was the opposite. The language was unspeakably advanced. Well, it was more accurate to say it was speakably advanced. Clara had first picked up on this when she tried to read it out loud. Further analysis found that what she had read out loud contained multiple meanings in many different languages. It wasn't in the sense that she was reading a series of puns or any sort of poetic or literary device. What she had read could be perceived as different sentences entirely. The only reason she was able to pick up on this quality was because she was educated in a dozen languages, which was enough for her to both convey and comprehend the multiple meanings contained in the entry. The speaker and the listener of the language, or the reader of the script, needed the same level of linguistic mastery to understand every possible meaning contained in their discourse. One would wonder why anyone would develop such a complex way to communicate, but Clara suspected that if one grew up in the place where the language was employed, it would be rather simple to learn. Perhaps even necessary. It wasn't the same as working backwards to piece everything together as a member of a monoracial society. Within the diary, there were more instances of the language being casually used in this manner, which further lent to the impression that those fluent in it had no difficulties with it. The paragraph about the Niseman not only contained what was written in Clara's simplistic translation, but described his features, personality and what attracted Elena to him. Rather than becoming wordy when she wanted to emphasize or expound on something, the density of her writing changed. A sentence could be a sentence, or it could be an entire paragraph packed into the same number of letters. It was an extraordinarily elegant way to communicate. It was also extraordinarily easy to lose. A language tailored for a multiracial society with its myriad of cultures. This required said society to remain functional or many elements would fall out of use. 2 or 3 generations of neglect would cause it to be mostly forgotten, save for the direct meanings relevant to each language that had sprouted from it. There was a game that nobles played, one where the players would showcase how cultured they were by conveying multi-layered dialogue that employed various languages in a manner similar to the way that this progenitor language worked. Highly skilled bards could also be very proficient at this, though their performances varied according to what they thought their audience could understand. If they believed that there were nobles or other similarly educated patrons present, bards would focus on employing these skills to gain their appreciation and secure the greatest earnings. While it did have its uses, Clara had thought that it was a mostly pretentious practice. The game was intellectually stimulating and provided an unmatched richness to dialogue when the players were similarly skilled, but it was also employed by the educated to mock the ignorant. One could say things that only certain others could understand, so entire conversations could pass over people's heads while they believed nothing was amiss. It was also dangerous to utilize when conveying sensitive information in public, as one could not tell who could and could not understand the full meaning of what was being said. Shortly after beginning her work on the diary's translation, Clara leaned towards the idea that the present-day game was most likely a vestige of this ancient language and those like it. Only people who retained the level of knowledge required to pass on the workings of this language could use it, and that knowledge slowly drifted from its source with every generation. Over time, no one would know its source, as demonstrated before her. The language was an art in itself, and only artists, scholars, and their patrons had retained its use. Magic that translated language only translated it in a single, direct way to the magic user, so there was no easy method to derive the full meaning of what was written without being a native user. A knock sounded from her office door. "Yes? My lady, Captain Cavallaro has arrived. I'll be right out." Clara rose from her desk, placing the diary and the translated page into the infinite haversack at her waist. Her fingers brushed lightly down her figure as she checked over her garb. Rather than thinking of it as clothing, there were more pieces that were not, so she had ended up, like Ludmilla, thinking of her outfit as equipment. In addition to a ring of sustenance, Lady Sheltier had bestowed a number of other magic items upon her. On her other hand was a ring of mental fortitude, which rendered her immune to mind-affecting spells and abilities. One of her earrings conferred immunity to disease and poison. Her need for sleep and sustenance was minimized. She couldn't be charmed or influenced by spells, skills and abilities that negatively influenced her mental state, and she couldn't get sick or be poisoned. This, however, was not all. A necklace of natural armor, an earring of deflection, and a set of braces of armor cleverly fashioned to fit under her sleeves made it harder to land a telling blow on her than it would be to wound a warrior in full plate armor through a sturdy tower shield. Over her shoulders was draped a mantle of energy resistance, which provided damage reduction against energy damage. Her cowl was a cowl of invisibility, and her circlet was a helmet that bestowed dark vision and sea invisibility. Appearing as a chain of ornate silver links adorning her waist, an adamantine girdle provided physical damage reduction. Attacks that managed to reach her would have to surpass this protection to deal bodily harm, and she could render herself invisible to avoid detection should it be prudent. Alongside several mundane belt pouches, an enchanted mithril dagger was sheathed in its scabbard on her left hip, something she had possessed since childhood. The infinite haversack hung over her right, filled with useful consumables, work-related materials, and various odds and ends. Her evening gloves were in reality items enchanted to increase her physical strength. On her feet were boots of swiftness. According to Lady Sheltier, she now had the raw physical capabilities of a platinum-rank adventurer, though civilian nobles did not have the conditioning, martial ability or skills of one. She was quite difficult to hurt now, but she was still a civilian noble under all of her equipment. The items were not something that would allow her to fearlessly wade into battle. It was meant to protect her from assassination attempts and buy her escorts time to respond to threats. In all, Clara was adorned in a panoply that even an emperor would be envious of, and she was not the only one who possessed it. There hadn't been an official announcement yet, but Lady Sheltier had informed Clara that her title would be transferred under her authority. Leanne and Florine would also become Lady Sheltier's vassals and so had received the same protective equipment. None of the other nobles received anything more than a ring of mental fortitude, so Clara could only wonder what sort of dangers they would be thrust into. Then again, Ludmilla being Lady Sheltier's vassal may have influenced their future liege's choices. In terms of their daily lives, they would continue to do what they had been doing. Their taxes would go to Lady Shiltir instead of the crown, and they were also no longer members of the royal court, as they were no longer the Sorcerer King's direct vassals. Since this was merely a technicality in the Sorceress Kingdom and they didn't participate in the proceedings of the royal court anyway, it was a non-factor. They would still participate as members of the House of Lords, though she supposed that the so-called Call-in faction would probably become known as Lady Shiltir's faction. Clara, Leanne and Florian were already working closely with Lady Shiltir, so the transition as a whole seemed natural. Most importantly, they, along with Ludmilla, could now work even more closely together as members of Lady Shiltir's court. This was not a whimsical arrangement for a group of friends, however. Lady Shiltir was the Minister of Transportation. The Sorceress Kingdom was rapidly rising in prominence, and it was up to them to pave the way both literally and figuratively. Infrastructure and logistics were two of the cornerstones of a nation's development, so the future of the Sorceress Kingdom had been entrusted to them. Captain Cavallaro awaited her in the gardens leading to the castle keep, fully equipped in arms and armor. He was speaking to a second paladin, a girl who was also adorned for battle. Like the paladin captain, she wore a surcoat indicating that she was a paladin of Sursana. The two lowered their heads at her approach. "Countess Corlin," Captain Cavallaro said stiffly, "I hope the day finds you well. I am not sure if you have met before, but this is Sister Alessia del Altamora." Comitessa, Alessia greeted her in a small voice. "She is the former squire that you spoke of?" Clara asked. "She is," the paladin captain unbent himself and nodded. "Now that she is here, we have twice the fighting strength." Clara suppressed a smile at his continued worry over the upcoming meeting. Ruin's Wake would be arriving at the harbor, and Captain Cavallaro insisted on being present to ensure that she was well protected by one who was experienced in dealing with the undead from Katza Plains. Ludmilla didn't have a problem with Ruin's Wake and her elder lich captain, which was good enough for Clara. Sister Alessia peered up at the other paladin. "Brother Marcus," she said, "why have I become fighting strength?" "You are a paladin, are you not?" "This is true, but I only came to bring the horses from Eranthal." "And so you have," Captain Cavallaro nodded. "Is there a pressing need to return? I recall that you were curious about the countess. It is not every day that you see a noble, yes?" "I live in the city, Brother Marcus," Sister Alessia replied. "You can see nobles there every day." Behind Clara, Tyre softly cleared her throat. "We should head over to the harbor," Clara said. "Ruin's Wake is due to arrive soon. Sister Alessia, if you would like to join us, I would be more than happy for your company." "Ruin's Wake?" "A ghost ship from the Katza Plains. They have expressed an interest in trade, and His Majesty directed them to me." Sister Alessia visibly brightened at her words. "I will come, Comitessa." She gave the warhammer at her hip a couple of confident pats. "It has been a few years since I have seen a ghost ship." As Sister Alessia did not have a horse, Clara invited her to ride in her carriage. The young paladin seemed uncomfortable at first, glancing about nervously at the cushy furnishings, ornate detailing and various magical conveniences for work and travel on the road. Several minutes after getting underway she seemed to settle down. "So, how has life in the Sorceress Kingdom treated you thus far?" Clara asked as the shadow of the castle gate darkened the windows. "I think it is not so bad, Comitessa," Sister Alessia answered, "but many things are different from the theocracy. I do not know this northern language, so the people in the city all sound very distant. When first we came through your lands, I thought maybe they are much like us here, after all, but those further north are truly a different people." "There should be a few in the city that should not seem so foreign to you," Clara said. "This is true," Sister Alessia nodded. "There are a small number of faithful in the city, and they have been educated by the temple. I had the good fortune of becoming acquainted with the one called Zaradnik, who speaks in our language. It was surprising to see a southerner in the north, but her hospitality is still much like that of her people." "Is that so?" "Yes, it is not, how can I say, pretentious? This northern culture has layers hidden behind layers. Even the common folk put on airs and swagger about if they think it will gain them something they do not deserve. It is difficult for me to discern where people truly stand." Their carriage slowed, and Clara opened a window to take a look outside. A caravan that bore the mark of a merchant company from the theocracy was plodding along in front of them. Those in the rearmost wagon appeared caught between assurance because of the paladin captain riding alongside the carriage and panic from solely to drawing it. I suppose allowing Captain Cavallaro to accompany me worked out in the end, after all, Clara said. Brother Markham, the captain did not come by your invitation? No, Clara smirked. When he heard that Ruin's wake was inbound, he insisted that he be there for my protection. Sister Alessia snorted and rolled her eyes. His addition to your escort means little when 4 Death Knights, a Death Warrior, and a Soul Eater are already present, she said. Brother Marcus is an idiot in certain ways. You have told him that his interest can never be returned, yes? I would think that a paladin captain understands this. As I say, Comitessa, Sister Alessia sighed, he is an idiot. You are not the first. Did you know that he had eyes for the Black Scale Dragon Lord? Clara raised an eyebrow at the mention of the Draconic Kingdom's sovereign. He tried to court Queen Auricula's? How would a paladin from the theocracy even meet her? Though not hostile to one another, the fact that the Draconic Kingdom's head of state had draconic lineage made them a non-human nation in the perception of the theocracy's citizens. Even if the inland sea did not divide their two nations, or rather, even with the inland sea providing a water route between them, the humans of the theocracy were loath to interact with their neighbors to the east. That the citizens of the Draconic Kingdom were fellow humans did not matter, and word of the theocracy's forces assisting the Draconic Kingdom would surely result in public outcry. We sent forces to assist the Draconic Kingdom with their furry problem on a somewhat regular basis, Sister Alessia said. Unofficially, of course. It is a nation led by a dragon lord, but if they fall to the beastmen, those beastmen become the theocracy's new neighbors. The relief forces pass through Altamura under the pretense that they are conducting exercises in Katsa. Usually it is an army group, a few paladin squadrons and, if the beastmen are especially frisky, some special forces. Was she allowed to share this? According to Ludmilla, Sister Alessia was a very strict and orderly individual. If so, it meant that she had thrown in her lot with the Sorcerer's Kingdom. This was probably to be expected, considering who ruled the nation. The young paladin continued speaking, oblivious to Clara's measuring gaze. Brother Marcus spoke quite passionately of Queen Auricula's, so he may still fancy her even now. After being his squire for nearly 8 years, I am aware of his preferences in women. In truth, you are one whom any man would desire in the theocracy, but your bloodline is too high above that of most. You can tell? Divine blood is common in the theocracy, Sister Alessia shrugged. So it is easy to notice in the north where its traits do not manifest so often. Brother Marcus knows more of this than I, yet he continues to entertain this fantasy of his. Since he is stationed here for the long term, Clara said, I am sure the temple will present him with matches soon. He and the others who came with him are far superior to the average man in the north, so there will be no lack of interest. The paladins who had come to serve in Corlin County had all been provided with personal accommodations. This was not only a show of generosity, their arrangements were ample enough to raise large families in. Leanne and Florine would probably crinkle their noses at the way followers of the Six treated human relations in much the same way that a farmer would consider the breeding of their livestock or cultivation of crops, but the world cared not for sensibilities that attempted to deny reality. Humanity was weak. Without the purposeful cultivation of strong bloodlines, they would remain weak. Refining magic, developing technology and creating powerful institutions ultimately hinged on having a strong biological foundation. Speaking of matches, what of you, Comitessa? Me? Clara blinked. I was matched to House Zaradnik. Sister Alessia fell silent for several moments, a look of confusion falling over her. I do not mean to trample upon your hopes, Comitessa, she said carefully, but no matter how vigorously you pursue your affections with the demeanor, no fruit will be born of it. It won't? A note of distress entered Clara's tone. This is a joke, I think. I hope. Clara couldn't keep the grin off of her face. It was House Zaradnik's heir, the Count Baroness' eldest brother. The temples have not approached me with any matches since then. I see, Sister Alessia said. You are approaching that age, though, perhaps you are undergoing reassessment? They shifted slightly as the carriage turned off of the highway and onto the ramp leading down to the harbor. Clara glanced out at the waterfront of the ghost ship's assigned berth, but she had still not arrived. Do you believe that a reassessment is in order? Sister Alessia held up a hand. I do not speak in an official capacity. In a large temple or cathedral, it is Allah's adherents who usually perform these duties, and there are several in the Irantal Cathedral. Perhaps you and they are already aware, so I was wondering if you would receive matches from the theocracy soon. The establishment of the Sorceress Kingdom has disrupted lines of communication with the South until recently, Clara said. Once things return to normal, I expect that they will do exactly that. Sister Alessia looked at her quietly for several moments. She licked her lips, as if hesitant to speak. If they requested that you stay in the theocracy, what would your response be? It is not a request that I can accommodate. I have my duties as a noble of the Sorceress Kingdom. There should be nothing wrong with them sending their matches to me, yes? I am not so sure about that, Sister Alessia said. It is difficult to tell because you are of civilian vocation, but I believe that you are extremely strong. Even being a civilian, you could easily be mistaken for a combatant, not a powerful one, but merely being recognized as such speaks for itself. If you become any stronger, the temples will have to consider the possibility that you have awakened to the potential of your divine blood. Clara slouched in her seat, releasing an annoyed sigh as she looked outside again. She was more than satisfied with the current course of her life. Though she did consider awakening to her divine lineage to be a blessing, the formalities that came with demigod status would be annoying in her present circumstances. If they wanted to match her with an equally eligible man, then he could come to her. It was safer to raise a family in the Sorceress Kingdom, anyway. Plus, there was a god and his godlike servants in residence. Not that the theocracy displayed any open recognition of the fact. I wonder what His Majesty would say about this. Her sigh misted the window. I am afraid to consider the results, Comitessa. Sister Alessia made a face. When it comes to matters of His Majesty, the people in the theocracy will not consider things in the same light as those who live here. Then, you believe? I do. Yet, it is the source of as much anxiety as assurance. When I am not kept busy enough, my thoughts stray. I wonder how things have turned out this way. As much as I wish to spread the good news, I cannot. I see how the faithful here conduct themselves, and I understand why he has chosen this place. Compared to this place, the theocracy is. Sister Alessia's words trailed off into an unhappy look. Clara couldn't blame her. The young paladin was born and raised in the theocracy, after all. How she was raised to interpret the world and act upon it probably seemed proper and righteous right up to the point that it didn't. Their success in procuring temple staff from the theocracy was in no small part due to the fact that both sides agreed the candidates would need to be world-wise and capable of adapting to life in a foreign land. Clara was under no illusion that the majority of the theocracy's citizens were the same. Inflexibility and intolerance had been allowed to take root in the strong foundations laid by their predecessors, and that strength only reinforced their increasingly belligerent views. Silence fell between them as their carriage finished making its way to the waterfront. One of Clara's human footmen opened the door. Clara, Sister Alessia and Tyre stepped out into the afternoon sun. It was not long until a fog bank rolled over one of the locks to the east. As it came closer, Captain Cavallaro shifted to a defensive posture. Alessia casually rested her hand on the head of her warhammer. If this ghost ship always comes with a fog, she mused, will it not cause problems for others? She had a point. Ludmilla mentioned that the ghost ship shrouded itself with a screen of fog, but Clara wasn't aware of the effect's extent. The mist formed an obscuring barrier that covered a third of the waterfront. Unlike a regular fog, the ruin's wake appeared to have created a shell of mist around itself. A large radius around the ship's hull was almost entirely clear. Clara's gaze traced over the vessel as it slowed to a stop before them. The ensign of the Sorceress Kingdom fluttered proudly from its mainmast, but the sails below were tattered and torn. From boat astern, its general appearance was that of an old wreck. How much of it they could improve upon, she did not know. It was a type of vessel known as a galleon, which was often employed in the ocean trade. She had come across their mention in her search for vessels suitable for both the Katza River and the inland sea that it emptied into. Unfortunately, the draft of this type of ship was too deep and the design unsuited for the way they would handle cargo in the future. After a minute or so, a gangplank was extended to the shore by a couple of skeleton crewmen. It did not bridge the stone of the harbor to the main deck, but to the gaping hole amidships. From the depths of the ghost ship's hold, a towering figure appeared. Captain Iska was reportedly an Elder Lich, but he did not resemble the Elder Liches of the Sorceress Kingdom in any way but for the fact that he possessed a skeletal form. When he rose to his full height, he towered above the Death Knights. His barrel chest, which was a meter across, filled out a finely crafted robe. A black tricorn cap with a grand white plume rested upon his skull. Upon his right shoulder was perched a bone vulture, and a cane in the captain's massive left claw tapped over the planks of the deck. He stood tall before them after disembarking, sweeping his gaze purposefully over the assembled group. The crimson points of his eyes went from Captain Cavallaro to the Death Knights. They scanned over the Death Warrior and her accompanying staff. Then they stopped at Sister Alessia. The Elder Lich returned to Ruin's wake. Sister Alessia, Clara asked, "What did you do?" "I have not done anything." Sister Alessia said, "I do not believe I have ever seen this particular Elder Lich. The last one that I came across was very shabby looking." "Well, excuse me for being shabby looking." Captain Iska appeared behind the railing above them, his gaze fastened to Sister Alessia. "It seems that you are acquainted," Clara said. "Acquainted? Ha! Nearly took my head off with her warhammer, she did." On either side, the Death Knights turned their attention to Sister Alessia. "I do not see a problem with this." Sister Alessia's voice was unperturbed. "It was on a border patrol 2 years ago. The way he approached me was suspect, as well. He leaned forward, saying, 'Little girl, I have something nice for you inside the ship.'" As one, the Death Knights looked up at Captain Iska. "Captain Cavallaro," Clara frowned, "are you going to be sending more 12? "Ah, I was 11 back then, Comatessa." 11-year-old squires into the Katza plains like that? Captain Cavallaro looked over his shoulder with a confused expression. This is normal, yes?" Clara didn't know what to think about his response at all. She would have to check with Ludmilla to see if sending children into undead-infested wastelands was really all right. The Death Knights looked like they were about to haul off Captain Iska as a suspicious individual, so she turned her attention back up to the Elder Lich. "Permission to come aboard, Captain Iska? We have business to discuss." Clara was led through the hold of Ruin's wake by Captain Iska. 2 of her Death Knight escorts stood sentry on both ends of the gangplank, while the remainder followed her inside. As they passed by the ghost ship's undead crew, she wrinkled her nose at the putrid stench of decay. "Captain Iska," she said, "you will have to remove any undead that emanate effects that are detrimental to the living. These ghasts will make people sick." Captain Cavallaro frowned. "Undead with touch attacks are also no good. Ghouls and ghasts will paralyze their victims, and I see others with various negative energy drains here. The undead labor employed in the Sorceress Kingdom are subject to similar considerations," Clara told the Elder Lich. "If you wish to convey goods between populations of the living, it is best to adhere to the same guidelines." "I understand, Countess Corlin," Captain Iska said. "I'll get to fixing that while we discuss things in my cabin." They made their way to the back of the ship, where one Death Knight and the Death Warrior assumed positions outside of the cabin door. The remaining Death Knight, Captain Cavallaro, and Sister Alessia joined them inside. Clara eyed the cabin's paneless windows. "Can extensive modifications be made to Ruin's wake, Captain Iska?" "How extensive, my lady?" "Considering your desire to trade," she said, "they would revolve around her ability to convey cargo and maintain the ideal conditions to transport various goods from place to place. Keeping things dry and secure would be the first thing to take care of, making sure ports and decks are sealed so that rain won't get in, for instance." Around them, the soft glow of the ghost ship seemed to fluctuate. "She says that as long as there are no major changes to her hull," Captain Iska said, "things like that should be fine. We've actually been trying to figure out if there are any improvements we can make to our image." "I am glad to hear that," Clara smiled. "For a moment, I was worried that those sorts of alterations would be impossible. What you said does mean that the hole in the side of her hull will stay. However, we will have to figure out a way to make sure your cargo does not fall out." The harbor staff would have a better idea of how to utilize the ghost ship's hold efficiently, so she would leave it to them. Reaching into her infinite haversack, she drew out the materials she had prepared. She placed them carefully on the captain's desk, which appeared to be a slab of stone salvaged from a ruin somewhere and smoothed flat. "These are..." A racket drifted in through the doorway, accompanied by the sound of objects thumping onto the wooden deck. Captain Cavallara turned at the sound, a hand over his warhammer. "What is that?" "I'm getting rid of the problematic crew members," Captain Iska told him. "The corpses'll disintegrate on their own in due time. All that's left are skeleton warriors and skeleton mages. Will that be fine, Lady Corlin?" "Thank you for acting so promptly, Captain Iska," Clara nodded. "The rest should meet our legal requirements. Skeletal undead also have the added bonus of being easy to pack away, so you should be able to make the most of your cargo capacity." She gestured to the various articles organized neatly on the captain's desk. "Here are some of the basic things that I thought you should start out with," Clara said. "At some point, you will need to purchase furniture for your cabin and any living crew members that you employ. Now, before we go over everything, there is something that I would like to ask." "What would that be, my lady?" "Lady Zaradnik mentioned that the purpose of your trading efforts is to secure resources for the Katsa Cabal." "That's right. In that case, would you like to hire merchants to trade on your behalf?" Beside her, a furrow appeared on Sister Alessia's brow. "Comatessa, you cannot mean." "I do. If His Majesty wished to extend the blessing of his wisdom to the Sorceress Kingdom, Clara would not do so in half measures. It no longer mattered if they were human, undead or otherwise." The crimson points of Captain Iska's eyes went between the two of them. "I'm afraid I don't follow." "Simply put," Clara said, "you are an arcane caster, Captain Iska. If your purpose is to acquire resources, there is no need to become a merchant. You can hire merchants to do these tasks for you while you and your partner transport goods. By delegating tasks to professionals who specialize in them, you will be free to pursue your own." "This reasoning appears sound," the Elder Lich said. "But, I'm ashamed to admit that I can't afford to hire any staff." "It is nothing to be ashamed of," Clara assured him. "It is also not a problem that you will have for long. The Katsa Cabal has a valuable resource naturally available to them, which you may easily exchange for other resources." Clara picked up a vellum scroll from the desk. "This scroll contains the first-tier Conjuration School spell summon spices. I have included 2 of these scrolls for each member of the Katsa Cabal. This spell will be what they use to help generate the starting capital for your efforts." "I see," Captain Iska nodded thoughtfully. "So the Katsa Cabal's naturally available resource is mana. A self-replenishing resource that Elder Liches have vast quantities of. I assume you can learn this magic?" The Elder Lich reached over to retrieve one of the scrolls from the desk. He carefully unfurled the oiled vellum in his claws and nodded several times after a brief inspection of its content. "It shouldn't be a problem at all, my lady. What sort of valuable commodity will we be summoning with this?" "Rather than any particularly valuable commodity, you should begin by trading in something liquid. My recommendation would be salt. The vast majority of the Sorceress Kingdom's subjects require salt to live, as does their livestock. There are also several industries that require large quantities of salt." The scroll in Captain Iska's fingers went up in a burst of azure flame. A stream of white crystals fell upon the desk and scattered to the deck. "Oops. I also recommend that you have a suitable container prepared when you cast the spell." "Right, so we learn the spell and conjure salt. What then?" "We can keep things simple, at first. Deliver your salt to Corlin Harbor, and a merchant will sell your goods at market. I can assign a merchant from one of my companies to you, and they will deduct the cost of the materials I have provided here from your sales. Is this acceptable?" Clara put the scroll in her fingers back on the desk. Captain Iska looked down at the ledgers, scrolls, stationery and writing supplies laid out before him. "To be honest," the Elder Lich said, "I'm already ecstatic over being able to make any progress at all. As ecstatic as an Elder Lich can become, at any rate. Beyond that, I have no sense for value when it comes to trade. I am, as you have already realized, not a merchant. The idea that I can hire minions, agents to trade on my behalf is an extraordinarily attractive prospect." "He said minions, yes?" Captain Cavallara frowned. "That he did." Sister Alessia peered at the Elder Lich. "Occupational habit." Captain Iska cleared his throat. "Will this be as simple as you say, Lady Corlin?" "It wouldn't be so simple for a living being. Ruin's Wake and her captain had an arrangement that was difficult to ruin. They had no personal living expenses, no need for food, water, shelter, or anything else of that nature. The costs that came with transportation were limited to whatever modifications that they needed to make to optimize their cargo capacity. They would be employing the same agent agreements as anyone else, and they were essentially converting mana into currency. Ruin's Wake would stay afloat as long as she had ports to trade in. Even if they lost all of their financial and physical assets, they could simply start again from scratch. Clara produced a pen and a sheet of paper, leaning over the desk to draw a simple flowchart. The best way to address your worries is to see the process at work for yourself, Clara told the elder lich. I am simply here to point you in the right direction and learn a bit about trade using large vessels. The cornerstones to your trade consist of your capacity to convert mana into goods, the cost-free transportation provided by Ruin's Wake, and the markets made available to you as citizens of the Sorcerer's Kingdom. As long as these cornerstones exist, you are effectively unsinkable in an economic sense. She unfurled a map of the Sorcerer's Kingdom, using ink bottles to hold down the corners. Everyone leaned in to look down at it. Ruin's Wake has an advantage in the fact that it does not require infrastructure to operate upon, Clara said. There are many communities in the nation that do not have access to infrastructure and are thus practically inaccessible to the wagons that most of our merchants employ. Exploiting this advantage will allow you to explore potentially lucrative trade routes. With the end of her pen, she tapped the markers for Erantle, Corlin Harbor, and each of the other 7 towns in the proximity of the Duchy of Erantle. In many nations, she said, urban centers act as hubs where resources are processed and redistributed. The vast majority of merchants make their living moving raw resources to towns and cities, then redistributing goods to the surrounding lands. This course that they travel over is the most basic form of a trade route. Since the bulk of the Sorcerer's Kingdom's industry is in the Duchy of Erantle, it is best that you remain in this area. Seems like most of the points on this map are connected by roads, Captain Iska noted. Where will we be going? Her pen stopped to rest on Corlin Harbor. Once you build up enough capital from salt production and chartered shipping between Corlin Harbor and Warden's Vale, she said, you can begin by purchasing lumber, stone, and leather from Corlin Harbor. We do consume these goods here, but even with our prices, there is an opportunity for a small profit in the east. The pen moved east to an unnamed marker near the border with the Baharuth Empire. Countess Wagner is raising a border town at this location, she said. As such, there will be demand for your goods. You will not be going here because of the small profits you will gain, however, but because of what you will purchase in this town. I see, so since we'll be going there anyway, we might as well make a little bit along the way. Correct. It is common for merchants to choose routes that will simply cover their expenses as they go between one lucrative region to another. Complete chains of contiguous stops that generate large profits will tend to be smoothed down by increased flows of trade. After selling your lumber, stone and some of your leather, you will take on some cargo that House Wagner produces in great quantities. Wagons? Captain Cavallaro frowned. They are House Wagner, Clara smirked, but in this case, I am talking about tools and parts. With the recent improvements to their workshops comes a dramatic increase in the quality and volume of their production. Ruin's Wake will be distributing these goods to the more inaccessible regions in the area. Clara moved the point of her pen northwest, stopping at a particular location. This next leg of the journey requires that you follow a specific course. It is a corridor that passes between 2 restricted areas in the Sorcerer's Kingdom. If you trespass on either, you will be intercepted or outright destroyed, depending on the circumstances. Well, that escalated quickly. Safety is assured so long as you remain within the corridor, Clara told him. Past that point, your course will take you northwest into the Great Forest of Tob. Your first stop will be at the Lizardman town on the southern shores of this lake. The industries here are very basic, so the tools, parts, and leather that you bring here will sell well. Can Lizardmen afford to purchase these manufactured goods? Alessia asked. They will only purchase what they need, Clara answered. You will also not likely be dealing in currency, but engaging in barter. For now, the town's primary exports are limited to handicrafts and products created by their mystics. Eventually, they will be exporting fish, but that will not be for a while yet. Still, there will be certain other tools that you will be offloading here. This town is currently the southern terminus for the new highway between the Sorcerer's Kingdom and the Dwarf Kingdom in the Azalisia Mountains. When construction resumes in the spring, they will purchase your tools. A rasping noise filled the air as Captain Cavallaro stroked his chin. Fine tools and leather for tribal trinkets? His voice was dubious. Where will you find a market for these? There will be pottery, woven goods and some jewelry, Clara said. Their mystics produce medicines and minor magic items. Despite its primitive state, it is still the largest center of demi-human industry in the Sorceress Kingdom. Our domestic policy encourages broad economic growth, and Ruin's Wake is ideal for servicing these remote areas. Clara pointed to a series of dots running through the Great Forest of Tob. This is where the fun part begins, she said. Well, at least from a merchant's perspective. Each of these markers is the location of a trade outpost established by Baroness Gonnier. They were raised with the intent of serving as both a social and economic hub for the tribes in their respective areas. Ruin's Wake will stop at each, trading the goods they've brought with them in exchange for the goods that can be found at each market. The pen traced along the line of dots until they reached the western extent of the Great Forest of Tob, then moved south through another series of dots running along the buffer zone between the Sorceress Kingdom and the Kingdom of Riastais. Trade outposts have been raised in the buffer zone along the Riastais border, as well, she said. They serve in the same capacity as the ones in the Great Forest of Tob, and you will similarly be trading at each. Once you reach the foot of the southern border ranges, your course will turn east, leading to Warden's Vale. There, you will trade and charter any free cargo space with goods for Corlin Harbor. The last leg of the route will follow the Katza River to this location. Clara straightened as she completed her explanation of the trade route, holding out her arms as she stretched. Sister Alessia suddenly reached out and punched Captain Cavallaro in the side. "Aye," he shouted, "what was that for?" "You know what for," Sister Alessia snapped. "Out. I am a paladin captain now, you know." "Aye, you are," the younger paladin replied. "Now go captain some paladins and stop licking the Cometessa with your obscene gaze." Captain Cavallaro spluttered as he retreated from the cabin, his face turning red. "I think it is best to marry him off sooner rather than later," Sister Alessia muttered. Captain Iska leaned over just in time to see the paladin captain scurry out of the Ruin's Wake. What just happened?" "Matters of breeding," Sister Alessia said. "Hun," the elder lich grunted. "It seems that the living have their issues too. I suppose that's one thing I won't ever have to worry about. If it's that much of a problem, how come you didn't become undead like Baroness Zaradnik?" Sister Alessia's face twitched, and she looked back and forth between Clara and Captain Iska. Clara sighed. "Did I say something wrong?" Captain Iska asked. Clara rested a gloved hand on Alessia's shoulder. The young paladin glanced at her out of the corner of her eye. "This knowledge is restricted to an exclusive few," Clara told them with a cold smile. "I trust that it will not become public. Sursana knows what will happen in that event." Alessia swallowed audibly and nodded. Clara's gaze traveled to Iska. "Of course, my lady," he said. "I'll make sure the ones back at home know to keep quiet about it as well." "Good." Clara's smile turned warm again. "Now, did you have any questions about this route?" "Just one," Captain Iska said. "Might I have that all in writing?"